The courtroom was cold, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the way justice had been stripped of warmth. Polished wooden benches stretched across the room like silent witnesses, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of verdicts that had changed lives forever. High above, the ceiling lights burned bright and unforgiving, casting harsh reflections on the marble floor. Everything in the room felt permanent, solid, unmovable, except the man standing at the defense table. Daniel Hayes stood with his hands cuffed in front of him, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. The metal pressed into his wrists, not painfully, but constantly, an unrelenting reminder that he no longer belonged to himself. His gray hair, once neatly combed every morning before work, now fell unevenly across his forehead. He hadn't bothered fixing it. He hadn't seen the point. He could feel the eyes on him. Some were curious, some were judgmental. Most were already convinced. To the people seated behind him, Daniel wasn't a man anymore. He was a headline. Corporate accountant embezzles millions. The words had followed him for months, on television screens, in newspapers, across phones held by strangers who would never know his name beyond the accusation. Daniel swallowed and forced himself to breathe. He remembered the first day he'd walked into that same courtroom, still believing logic would protect him. He had trusted numbers his entire life. Numbers didn't lie. Records could be traced. Truth, he thought, always had a way of surfacing. He had been wrong. At the prosecution table, the lawyer shuffled his papers with relaxed confidence, already rehearsing the speech that would end Daniel's freedom. He didn't look at Daniel, not because he was avoiding him, but because Daniel was no longer worth looking at. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Daniel's knees trembled slightly as he rose. He steadied himself, not for his own sake, but because he knew his son was watching. Ethan sat alone on the back bench, his posture stiff, his hands locked together as if holding on to something fragile and invisible. He hadn't shaved in days. Dark circles framed his eyes. Every dollar he had went into bus tickets, cheap meals, and copies of court documents he barely understood. He caught his father's glance. Daniel looked away first. He was ashamed, not because he was guilty, but because he had failed to protect the one person who depended on him. After his wife died, Daniel had promised himself that no matter how hard life became, Ethan would never feel alone. And now, here he was, powerless. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes," he said calmly, flipping through the case file, "this court has reviewed the evidence presented." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. He could already hear the echo of the gavel in his mind. The judge continued, "The documentation, witness testimony, and financial records suggest intentional misconduct." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Daniel felt his chest tighten. His thoughts drifted, not to prison walls, but to small moments he might never see again. Morning coffee, conversations that meant nothing until they were gone. His son's voice asking him for advice he wouldn't be there to give. He opened his eyes and looked at Ethan one last time. "I'm sorry," he thought. The judge adjusted his glasses and raised the gavel slightly. "Therefore, this court is prepared to proceed with sentencing." The wood hovered in the air, and in that suspended moment, between a life that had been and a future about to be stolen, no one in the room expected what would happen next. The gavel never came down. It hovered in the judge's hand, suspended in the air like a final breath that refused to leave the body. The courtroom remained frozen in expectation until a single voice broke through the silence. "Wait." The word was soft, but it cut through the room sharper than a shout. Heads turned almost in unison. At the back of the courtroom, Ethan Hayes had risen to his feet. The wooden bench creaked beneath him, an ordinary sound that suddenly felt out of place in a room built on rigid control. For a brief second, no one spoke. The interruption itself seemed unreal. Then came the first laugh. It was quiet, almost polite. A few spectators exchanged amused glances. Someone in the press section smirked and lowered their pen, sensing a distraction rather than a development. To them, this wasn't defiance, it was desperation. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Young man," he said firmly, "this is a court of law. Sit down." Ethan didn't move. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. His legs felt weak, but something stronger than fear held him upright. He looked at his father's back, the slumped shoulders, the hands bound in metal, and felt a heat rise in his chest. If he sat down now, he would never forgive himself. "Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice shaking at first, then steadying. "Please." The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with visible amusement. "Is this some kind of family plea?" he said with a laugh. "We've already heard enough fiction today." The room chuckled. Ethan swallowed hard. He stepped forward, just one step, enough to be seen, not enough to be stopped. "Let my father go," he said clearly, "and I will make you stand." For half a second, the courtroom was silent. Then laughter erupted. It was louder this time, unrestrained, confident, cruel. The prosecutor laughed openly, shaking his head. "You?" he scoffed. "You look like you can barely afford that jacket." Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, suppressing a smile. The judge exhaled slowly, clearly annoyed. "This court does not tolerate theatrics," he said. "You have 30 seconds. Speak, then sit down." 30 seconds. Ethan felt every eye on him now, not with curiosity, but with expectation of failure. This was entertainment to them, a poor boy standing against a finished verdict. He took a breath and spoke. "You see someone with no power," Ethan said. "No money, no connections." His voice echoed across the room, steadier with each word. "But power isn't always loud, and it doesn't always sit at the front." The laughter began to fade. The prosecutor's smile stiffened slightly. "My father taught me numbers," Ethan continued. "He taught me that when something doesn't add up, you look closer." Daniel slowly turned his head. For the first time that day, confusion replaced resignation in his eyes. Ethan met his gaze for a split second, just long enough to say everything he could not say out loud. "Trust me." The judge leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Continue," he said. Ethan nodded. "You laughed because you think this is over," he said quietly. "But you never asked why someone like me would stand up now, when everything is already decided." The room fell silent. The laughter of power had done its job, but it had also revealed something dangerous: arrogance. And for the first time since the trial began, certainty began to crack. Silence settled over the courtroom like a held breath. The laughter was gone now, replaced by something far more dangerous: uncertainty. Ethan stood alone in the open space between benches, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on him. 30 seconds had passed long ago, but no one had stopped him. That alone told him everything. "I wasn't supposed to be here," Ethan said quietly. "Not in your world." His voice carried without effort. Every word seemed to land exactly where it needed to. "For 3 years," he continued, "I cleaned offices at night. I emptied trash cans, wiped fingerprints off glass tables, and listened to conversations people thought no one would ever hear." The prosecutor shifted in his chair. Ethan took another step forward. "They talked freely," he said, "about numbers that didn't match, about accounts that needed a name to disappear into." Daniel's eyes widened. Ethan reached into his backpack slowly, deliberately, as if he were afraid someone might stop him. He pulled out a small, scratched flash drive, ordinary, cheap, and completely underestimated. "This," he said, holding it up, "is what happens when you ignore the people you think are invisible." "Objection," the prosecutor barked, standing abruptly. "This is highly irregular and completely inadmissible." The judge raised a hand, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," he said. "I want to see where this goes." A ripple of tension moved through the courtroom. Ethan walked to the clerk's desk and placed the flash drive down. His hands were steady now. Fear had been replaced by focus. "These files are backups," Ethan said. "Emails that were deleted, audio recordings that were never meant to be saved, financial transfers that were buried under shell companies." The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The first email appeared. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Instructions to alter records, requests to move funds. A final message: "Hayes will take the fall." Daniel's knees nearly gave out. More files followed. Audio crackled through the speakers, voices laughing, casual, careless. "He's too clean," one voice said. "Perfect scapegoat." The prosecutor's face drained of color. Ethan didn't look at the screen. He looked directly at the prosecution table. "Do you recognize your voice?" he asked calmly. The room exploded into whispers. The judge stood. "Order!" he commanded, slamming the gavel down for the first time. Bank records filled the screen next, numbers flowing not into Daniel's accounts but into offshore holdings. The name attached to them was unmistakable. The prosecutor staggered backward, gripping the table. "This is fabricated," he muttered weakly. Ethan shook his head. "No," he said. "It's documented." He turned to the judge. "My father didn't steal anything," Ethan said. "He discovered the theft, and when he refused to stay quiet, they chose him." The judge removed his glasses slowly. The air felt heavy, electric. For the first time in the trial, the truth wasn't defending itself. It was standing. And the boy no one noticed had just rewritten the balance of power. No one spoke. The courtroom, once loud with laughter and certainty, now felt hollow, like a room emptied of air. Every eye was fixed on the screen at the front, where the evidence still glowed, undeniable and merciless. The judge remained standing. His hands rested on the bench, knuckles pale as if he were physically holding the weight of what had just been revealed. He looked down at the documents, then at Daniel Hayes, still cuffed, still trembling, still condemned by a verdict that now hung in pieces. The judge removed his glasses. In his years on the bench, he had learned to recognize lies. But what lay before him wasn't deception. It was exposure. "Bailiff," he said slowly, his voice steady but heavy, "remove the handcuffs from Mr. Hayes." For a moment, no one moved. Then the bailiff stepped forward. The metallic click echoed through the courtroom, louder than any gavel strike that day. The cuffs fell away, clattering softly onto the floor. Daniel's breath hitched, his legs buckled, and he sank to his knees, overwhelmed not by victory, but by the sudden return of dignity he had been denied for so long. His hands shook as if they were learning freedom again. Ethan rushed to him without thinking. He knelt beside his father, wrapping an arm around his shoulders, grounding him. "It's over," Ethan whispered. "I've got you." The judge turned toward the prosecution table. The man who once commanded the room now stood rigid, his face ashen, his confidence shattered. Papers lay scattered before him like the remains of a crumbling wall. "For the record," the judge said, his voice firm, "this court recognizes a deliberate attempt to manipulate evidence, obstruct justice, and falsely accuse an innocent man." A murmur surged through the spectators. Cameras clicked furiously. The judge's gaze hardened. "Bailiff," he continued, "place the prosecutor under arrest." The words landed like thunder. Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor stumbled back as the bailiff approached, panic finally breaking through his polished exterior. "This is outrageous," he stammered. "You can't do this." But the courtroom had already turned. The handcuffs closed around his wrists. This time there was no laughter. As he was led away, the judge addressed the room. "This court will reopen every case connected to these findings," he declared. "An independent investigation will follow." He paused, then looked at Ethan. "Young man," the judge said, his voice softening just slightly, "you showed this court something we too often forget." Ethan stood slowly. "That justice doesn't belong only to the powerful," the judge continued. "It belongs to those brave enough to stand when silence is easier." Daniel rose beside his son, still unsteady but free. For the first time, father and son stood side by side, not divided by bars, not separated by power. The truth had not whispered. It had stood. And the system had been forced to listen. The courthouse doors opened slowly, and sunlight poured in like something long forgotten. Daniel Hayes hesitated at the top of the steps, blinking as the warmth touched his face. For months, his world had been gray. Courtrooms, cells, sleepless nights filled with fear. Now even the air felt different, lighter, as if freedom had its own scent. Ethan stood beside him, close enough to catch him if his legs gave out again. Neither of them spoke at first. Below the steps, reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Voices competed for sound bites and headlines, but Daniel barely heard them. The noise felt distant, unimportant. What mattered was the hand on his arm. He turned to his son. Ethan looked exhausted. His eyes were red, his shoulders tense. But there was something else there too, relief, quiet strength, and a maturity forged in suffering far beyond his years. Daniel's voice broke. "How long?" he asked softly. Ethan frowned. "How long? What?" "How long have you been carrying this alone?" Daniel asked. Ethan hesitated, then shrugged gently. "Long enough," he said, "but you carried me first." The words struck Daniel deeper than any accusation ever had. He pulled Ethan into an embrace. Tight, desperate, unashamed. He held his son the way he had when Ethan was a child, the way he used to hold him after nightmares. Only this time the nightmare was over. They descended the courthouse steps together. Each step felt symbolic. Away from shame, away from silence, away from a lie that had nearly erased them both. Daniel's name would take time to heal, but it was no longer broken. At the bottom of the steps, Daniel stopped. He turned back once and looked at the building behind them. Tall, imposing, once terrifying. Now it was just stone. "I thought I failed you," Daniel said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "You taught me to stand up when something's wrong," he replied. "Today I just did what you showed me." Daniel smiled through tears. They walked on side by side, disappearing into the crowd. Not as victims, not as symbols, but as father and son who had faced a system and refused to bow. Behind them, a courtroom would never forget the day power laughed, and truth stood. And ahead of them, life, ordinary, precious life, waited patiently to begin again. Months later, the courtroom was quiet again, not with the heavy silence of fear, but with the calm that follows truth. The investigation had unraveled a network of corruption far larger than anyone had imagined. Executives resigned. Cases were reopened. Names once untouchable were spoken with caution, and Daniel Hayes' name was cleared. Official letters arrived one after another, formal apologies written in careful language, unable to undo what had been taken, but acknowledging what had been stolen: time, dignity, peace. Daniel returned to work slowly, not as an accountant chasing numbers, but as a man who understood their power. He began teaching, showing young people how to read what others hoped would never be seen. Ethan went back to school. At night, he still worked, no longer cleaning offices, but tutoring students who, like him, had been overlooked. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. He didn't need recognition. One evening, as they sat together at a small kitchen table, Daniel watched his son in silence. "You know," Daniel said softly, "they laughed at you." Ethan smiled faintly. "They laughed because they thought I was small," he replied. "They didn't know I was standing on the truth." Outside, the city moved on, unaware of how close injustice had come to winning. But somewhere in a courtroom that would never forget, a lesson remained. Power listens only when truth refuses to sit down. And sometimes the strongest voice in the room belongs to the one everyone ignored.